Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Sean, for the introduction. As Sean already said, I'm originally German. I'm living in Australia at the moment, and I'm heading the, and I'm heading the Monash Institute for Medical Engineering as a director, and I do that since 1.5 years. And in parallel, and you see that below that, I'm still also heading an institute in Germany, which is called the Institute for Cardiovascular Engineering at the RWTH Aachen University, which is an engineering university, about 25,000 engineering students, so quite big. Who knows it? Nobody? That's bad. So, and I'm doing that in parallel, so that means at the same time I'm running an institute here and in Germany. That means a lot of times in the evening on the video conferencing systems, etc., but it works. And I would like today, he said, something interesting. I think it's not so interesting because we're talking about product development, nothing, it's dry stuff. I would like to go with you through a development process, particularly for medical devices, because medical devices have their specialties. The first thing is always, what is a medical device, if we talk about medical device development? Now, according to the definitions, if you look at what's called the European Medical Device Directives, I go a little bit into that afterwards. Medical device are all devices that are used for diagnostics, therapy, monitoring, and prevention. These are medical devices. What's also important to understand, medical devices are not cosmetic products. There are no medical devices. I know there is always discussion about animal trials on things, if it's for cosmetics or it's for a medical device. Cosmetics are no medical devices. Drugs are no medical devices. They have very special approval scenario and so a very different pathway. There are, of course, some combination products when it gets sometimes difficult. Maybe some of you heard already about a drug-eluting stent. That means it's a medical device that gives a drug when it's in the body. It gives a drug to the body. So that means we're getting more and more in this field where it's getting a little connected. So it's more difficult to really separate that. Human transplant, a heart transplant, a kidney transplant. The kidney is not a medical device. Medical device has to be tested extensively. You cannot take a kidney out, test it extensively, and then put it in the next person. It wouldn't survive it. So also animal tissue. Animal tissue is very often also used in medical devices. No, it's used, and it can be used in medical devices. Maybe some of you heard the name porcine heart valve. That means a heart valve that's made basically from the heart valve of a pig. And that's then put in a stent frame, and the valve is made for it. I show you an example a little later. So that is a medical device. But if it's only the animal tissue itself, it's not a medical device. But if you have something around it, a stent frame, whatsoever, then it's a medical device. So it's very important to understand that, because it's also important for your process when you develop a medical device. And if you look at them and you know a lot of devices that you have every day, you have some stethoscopes, you have maybe a bandage around the foot, you may have some infusion tubing, you may have some gloves even, but with the gloves you already start to maybe touch a wound or something like that, so it gets a little bit more critical. You have a defibrillator or an oxygenator. Oxygenator is, let's simplify it as an artificial lung. That means something where you can oxygenate the blood with. And you have a blood pump, for example. That is a pump to support the heart when it's failing, when it gets tired, to support it so that you can make the patient survive longer. And you have, for example, a heart valve. If you look at these devices from the left to the right, they are quite different, and you can imagine that it's quite different to develop a Band-Aid or bandage or a pump. And they are classified. So this depends on the duration of application, the invasiveness, the energy supply, if it's active or passive, the risks associated. So they have, according to that, they have a certain classification. That is also very important to understand. When you start developing a medical product, you should, at the very beginning, look what class is that. Because you can imagine, and we get to that, the higher the class, the more you have to do in order to develop it or to approve it. Class 1 are the simple ones. Class 2A, a little bit more complex, as I said. The glove, you may already touch a wound. That means we can already get a little bit more critical. Of course, the more you get invasive or even active with the pump, this pump has a motor and it pumps. That means it's an active device. And we know that our circulatory system or our heart is also pretty active. That means you suddenly have an active device that works together with an active device, the heart. The one you can control, but the other one, difficult. It has its own life. So these are things that you have to take in consideration. That is in Europe and Australia, and that is how the regulatory bodies define it. And you see, I write Europe, Australia. Australia, interestingly, is more looking to Europe in terms of medical devices. That means they look how they do that in Europe to approve a medical device and how they classify a medical device. So not what many people would think, that they would look more to the US, because in the US it's a little different classification. In the US they say this in the middle is all class 2. They don't have A and B, it's all class 2, and we have 1, 2, 3. But we get to these different routes and pathways to approve a medical device a little later, so that is basically a little difference already. So, if we look at some of the devices that you know from maybe hospitals, from the market, if you have been into this, you have been in that field for a while now, so that you know some of these areas. We have walking aids, wheelchairs, patient beds, bandaging material, as you saw before, that is all class 1. So these are these simple devices, and I can already tell you, in order to get them approved, you don't have to do very much. Even nobody looks at it. The manufacturer can declare, I did everything fine, and then he declares that and assures that he did everything right, and then he can already put it on the market. So rather easy. Whereas the other ones, and we'll get to that, some authorities will ask for documentation how you did all that and will have to approve it. Class 2A is medium risk, dental materials, for example, what you use in the tooth. Ultrasonic devices, hearing aids, contact lenses, dental crowns, X-ray films, things that are not so in direct contact. Of course, you can say if you look at dental materials, they are in direct contact, but not so much with blood and things, so it's more or less not so dangerous. Class 2B, there we're getting it gets a little bit more critical. You see anesthesia devices, respirators, oxygenators, as I said before, the artificial lung, as you could call it. Dialysis devices, you know, dialysis, when you have the kidneys are failing, you can go on dialysis, and that means there you're not in the body. That means not an implant, but you take the blood out of the body and lead it through an extracorporeal circuit, and so it gets already critical because the blood is in contact with some stuff. Blood bags, of course, also even condoms, dental implants, monitors, and external defibrillators. They are 2B, so that means they have already a higher requirement. And then it gets to class 3, which is then heart catheters. That means particularly whenever you go directly to the heart, you're always in class 3, because that is always, if you do something wrong there, the heart stops, that's it. So that means these are very high risk devices, heart-lung machines. Heart-lung machines, do you know what a heart-lung machine is? If you do surgery on a heart, you have to stop it for a while. It's like working on an engine on a car. If you work on the engine, you would stop it first, and then you work on it. But if you stop the heart, you don't have a circulatory system. So it's a machine that then keeps your circulatory system running, and you can do surgery on the heart. That's a heart-lung machine. Blood pumps, as I mentioned before, that can help the heart, or even there are total artificial hearts, even machines, if you can say, that replace the heart. You take the heart out and you put a total artificial heart in. That's, of course, a class 3 device with high risk. Heart valves, coronary stents, artificial joints, even resorbable surgical sutures. They can also be difficult. Sounds easy, sutures, but these sutures with time they go away because they dissolve in the body. That can create trouble if what the sutures should hold together, is not grown together yet. It can get trouble. So that means even that is something that has some risks. Breast implants, drug-eluting devices. Drug-eluting devices, that's this combination devices I mentioned at the beginning. When you have a device and you have a drug on the device, and when you implant it, it gives the drug out there in order to cure the area also. So this is these are some examples for medical devices in order to give you an understanding what you're talking about. And you can mention it, this is much easier than this. If you go for something like that, if you develop a heart valve, if you develop a pump or something, you're talking about 5, 10 years of development time easily, and you talk about 25, 30, 40, 50 million dollar or something easily on development, because it's a very long process. So if we then look at a typical development process, this is when you develop a car or whatsoever. That's what you do. That you have to, at the beginning, you have to have your concept, you have an idea, and you say, well, I will check first of all, does the customer need, do the people need something like that? And is there, I do some market studies, who is on the market, what's going on there, how big is the market, does it pay out? You look at legislation, is there any legal issues that I have to consider, and what are the competitors? But this is the first step. This is only the concept. That means I would call it scoping. You just look at it and say, well, is there something? And then when you see, aha, yeah, it looks good, the product concept seems to be okay, then you go a little bit deeper into that and you make your deeper market research. That means you look a little bit closer on the needs and all these things. Then you, from step to step, you go deeper into it, business analysis with cost benefit, well, which resources do I need, etc. And then you develop the main development of the product is then in this step, where you make your technical specification, your prototype to your trial production, etc. And finally you launch your product. This is for a standard product. Medical device may be much more different. So this, as you see from engineering standpoint, I understand most of you are engineers. Who is engineer? Who is something else? So, but yeah, mostly engineers. So from an engineering standpoint, straightforward. I look, what do the people need? There is some business issues. I look for people need, and then I go through my process, and then finally I just put it on the market. Sounds simple. It's not so simple, but this is how you do. Medical device is a little bit different. Now, the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. This is one big, as you call it, competent authority that gives all the rules for medical devices, and their approval says that a medical device development process is that you have a discovery and ideation, that you have some invention prototyping, you have some preclinical testing, some clinical testing, a regulatory decision, product launch, and post-market monitoring. On the first side, it looks quite similar. You would say, so what's the difference? So medical device is like everything else. On the second side, it's a little different. First of all, this is maybe a part that is also an iterative process that you would do for another product also. But there are some implications when it comes to the approval of the device. That means you have to do some clinical testing. You have to test your device in the clinic, have to find out or look at or prove that it's safe. And then you get your regulatory approval. That means there is some authority like this FDA that will finally go through all your documents and say, oh, it's okay, you can put it on the market or not. And this is the main difference. This is a very big difference for medical devices, because this requires a long time. And before you may do your first implant or whatever, if it's an implant or whatever you do in the body, you have to do a lot of development, a lot of testing, because they want to make sure that you don't kill somebody, even with your first implant. So if you then look a little closer, this looks rather easy. If you look a little closer and to the development process, this is basically a matrix of what you do then in a medical device development. And now you see it's already getting much more complicated and much more elaborate. So this is what you call the stage gate medical device development process. It was developed by Stanford University, and it's something that is often used in medical device. Who has ever worked with did you have some lectures on development or general product development a lot with these, also product management, etc., project management? And you sometimes hear then people say, if I put this to the wall, say this is what you all have to do for medical device. They say, today we make agile. We make everything agile. We change things every time. This is a little different. We'll get to that. So this is a little old-fashioned, old-fashioned development of a medical device, but you always have to take in mind, you're not developing an app or something that if it doesn't run, if it crashes, you make the next version and send the next version out. This is agile. You cannot do that with a patient. Shouldn't crash. So that means you have to make sure that everything's fine. So if we go through that a little bit, and if we will go through this development process a little bit to give you some basic indications. If we look at that, and I don't have to go in details now, just look at it broadly, and you see I've made some circles, not circles, it's rectangles around some of these points. And all these points that I have highlighted are processes that are defined by the regulatory process. That means this is what you have to look at and what you will be asked for at the end in order to get a regulatory approval. That means this development is from the beginning very much driven by these whatever authorities that will finally give you the approval for that product. And that is what the main difference to a regular device that you develop. You have similar things sometimes in other areas. We are a lot talking these days, unfortunately, about airplanes because of the MAX 8 stuff that you had now. And there is discussion about the FAA, this American flight, authority, because they also approve airplanes. They have similar very high quality standards usually, and it's not clear whether these high quality standards were kept in terms of the approval process, but you can see that's a little similar. So with airplanes, because also if they fall down, there are hundreds of people killed. And so that's also a very high quality standard, and I can tell you that in medical device industry, when it came up, the airplanes were there a little earlier, when the medical device industry followed pretty much some of the quality standards of the airplane industry. So that means almost half of all the activities and decisions in the medical device development process are affected by regulatory requirements. So you better know exactly, coming back to that, what class of device do I have, what are the problems in my approval, etc., because you can get stuck into that. So let's go a little bit, because of that, let's go a little bit deeper into that. By the way, I should make one comment. It's called the stage gate process. Also something that you may have learned before. That means you have a stage in development, and then comes a gate. And it's like I'm walking on a path where you have several gates. That means you do your first stage, you do everything, and then you look, have I done everything? And then you go through the gate and you close it behind you. That's very important in development because it's always, we engineers like to do things, perfection things forever. And that's also a danger. So if you say, I have a certain stage, I've done it, I have reached what I wanted to do, I go through the gate and I close the gate behind me. I don't go back. I don't go back and say I start from scratch. That means you always go forward. It's something that you always should think about, because otherwise you get stuck in early stages and try to improve things there. Always try to think about these things. So that means we go through certain stages, and then at the end we hopefully have our product. Let's go through these stages. We have at the beginning, the first one is the initiation and the opportunity and risk analysis. And at the end of gate one, we have the project definition. You always see here the decisions that are made at the end of this stage. And you see here the functional group means the people that are involved in that. And you also see it's not that the engineer says, I have a great idea and I go into the lab and I start tomorrow. That's what happens at universities, but that's not always the real story, because you have a lot of cross-functional management that doing financial reviews. You have marketing issues, research, legal, regulatory, reimbursement. We'll get a little bit more into that. That means you have a lot of people involved, and what you do in phase one, similar to what we had before, that you do a scoping. You say like, do I have money for it? Financial review, I have to know, do I have money for it? And you do a marketing analysis, what's on there? I have an idea and say, is there a market for it? Or is it just an idea that nobody needs? and also look at the competitors. Then I look at early risk in my development. I say, what are the risks if I do this device? Do I have major risks that I cannot handle, and then finally it all turns out that I never get to a target because the risk is too high? What are legal issues? The buzzword IP, intellectual property. Is there something that legally it doesn't make sense to develop this because somebody else did it already or has IP on it, so I will run in trouble? Regulatory, what is my regulatory path? That's very important. That's what I said, because remember, more than 50% is regulatory. That means if you take the wrong path, it could cost you a lot of money. So you better think about that before, because there are different options in going through that. At one point, we'll get to that. And also reimbursement paths. Also, we'll get a little bit deeper into that. I'll explain. When you have done that, you have seen at gate 1, okay, I have my market opportunity, I have some IP seems okay on the first scan. That's in a very first rough approach. I see it's quite okay, I could do it. And I could even manufacture it, and the risk is all manageable. And this is also a very important point there is, if I look at a project, and that's more general, and that particularly applies also to medical products. It's a golden rule that you also always should put in your heads. You can influence the costs and the time and everything of your development at the very beginning very much. That means there you have it in hand how good your development goes, and how expensive it gets, your project gets. You have, because you still have a lot of open areas where you can decide which way you go. So you have a good, this is when you have the highest influence opportunity. At the end, the further you go in your stages, you are in your project, the less possibility you have to change anything. And the money goes up, as you see here, where you spend more and more money, and you have no chance to influence it anymore. And it goes all down the drain because you're burning the money, and you say, oh, I should have done that at the beginning. I call it the 80-20 rule always 80-20. Many people do something once in a lab and they say, look, I'm almost finished. It looks like 80% of what I've done is finished. That may be even true. Looks good. You already have a device. It already, I don't know, pumps water or something like that, and you say the final step is just a little bit. This is 80% done, and you have to do the last 20%. But always keep in mind, to do the first 80%, you need only 20% of time and money and everything. You need 80% of the time and money to squeeze out the last 20%. And the further you get to the last percentage, the higher the money you get. I have put that in my head always when I talk to my students always, because they say, oh, we are just finished. And you say, no. If we do a pump in our lab and we have spent, let's say, 500,000 to make the first prototypes, until we have it on the market, we'll have at least 30, 40 million spent. So then you know what it means, 80-20. Get through regulatories, get this manufacturing set up. All these things, that costs a lot of money, a lot of time, and so always keep that in mind. Don't waste too much time at the beginning, but plan very good. And that's what we say here. The costs and the success are mostly defined in early stages. That's a golden rule. And that's not my diagram. I took that from somewhere. I hope I put the source somewhere. No, I didn't. Oh, shit. But you can find it everywhere. And the second thing is, the second image is also quite similar. It's called the rule of 10. The rule of 10 means when I go from one phase to another and have a mistake in my development, I went through the gate and said everything's fine, and then I find out I have to go back because something's wrong with my device, and I have to go back one stage. And that's the rule of 10. The further down the line you are, the more that costs. Because you have all your production. We had it once. We had a heart valve that we developed, and we found a flaw in the design. We had all the production set up. Everything was there. We had a burn rate of about 200,000 euro at that time per month. And then we find out we have a flaw in the design and have to go back to scratch, more or less. And your production is running. Everything's running already. And that costs tremendous money. So that means also watch out that you do your failures as early as possible, or the other way around, if you say the later a failure appears, the more expensive it is, again, plan at the beginning. Have a good planning at the beginning. Yeah? Not be too agile in a medical device. And this is the last slide that also proves that this brings it all together. You have the costs going up, the failure costs going up, the cost reduction opportunities go down. You cannot reduce the costs anymore. That's when many companies go down the drain, because this happens. And what you also have, you can determine also the life cycle costs at the beginning, already pretty much up to 70% in the first phase. You can determine your life cycle costs. Life cycle costs are all the costs, everything that comes up through the life cycle of a product. Take a car, you buy a car today and you drive it 10 years. And you take every dime that you paid for this car, put it on in an Excel sheet or so. The cost that you overall have spent, that's finally the life cycle costs. And you can determine that already at the beginning to 70%. So that means I'm taking always more of these slides in order to really implant it also in your brains. Look at that at the beginning. Do a diligent planning, or what we call a front loading at the beginning if you do a medical device. Be sure what you're doing. Then you have a nice pathway. It doesn't work always. As Sean said, I have 13 companies, but 7 made it, so it doesn't work always. But that is also, you never know, because we get to risk a little later. So let's go just briefly through these things that have to be done in that part. You have a market analysis. Market analysis is the size, but you also look at trends, growth rate, profit potential, business strategy. So it's not just, I don't know, there are 200,000 patients and I can give 10% of my device and that means I sell 20,000 per year. That's not only the market analysis. There's much more behind that. But this is done in the second stage even deeper. Sales is demand, competition, sales channels, reimbursement, sales channels. We are in Australia. You have distributors here from the major companies and they have their distributing people here and they sell the things in the hospital. You may go to, and I don't want to talk negative about countries or whatever, but you may go to the one or the other country. You only get it sold if you know somebody who has a friend who is the brother of somebody who is in the hospital and buys the stuff. To say it this way, without being negative. So that means you have to exactly know how are my channels to get it into the hospital. Which ways do I have to go? Do I go there and sell it myself, or do I take this friend of a brother or something like that? So these, it is reality, and this is what you have to look at. Reimbursement, very important. The same thing. In some countries, Australia has a very good healthcare system. You go in a hospital, most of the things you get reimbursed, at least to a large degree. You can go to other countries. You can go to some countries where if you need a heart valve, you have to buy it yourself. And that can be $20,000 plus the surgery. So you have to buy it yourself. There is no reimbursement. So that means when you say there is my market and it's, I don't know, so many trillions of dollars, that doesn't mean that you get this. It depends if the people really would take it because if they can afford it. So these are all things that are very important. Procurement, raw materials, tools, semi-finished products, energy, job markets. Are people there that can help me to develop good trained people that can help me to do my development? That's very important. Then the product, of course, the composition, how it performs, prime costs that I have, product testing, regulatory, very important. We have talked about several times. Merchandising, and also financing. Financing, is there a capital market? You know, it happens, unfortunately, very often that in Australia very nice things are developed, and then the people go to the US because there's the capital market. That's where they get the money for their developments. So the capital market plays a major role. That's why many developments go finally in other countries from here also. So, or money market, which is more the short-time money, or even currency market. The medical products in Australia is about $2.1 billion. Did we say that? 2.1 billion? Was that the number? I'm taking that out of my head. I think it was $2.1 billion. And we just wrote that 80% of that is imported. That means if you think about currency, if there is a little slight change, 10% in currency, imagine what it takes for you to compensate that, for Australia, for example, to compensate that. So that is something that plays in your development, finally. You always have to at least have that on the radar. I'm not saying it's your major point, but you have to have it on the radar. So if we go to the second step, we go a little deeper, we go from step to step or from stage to stage deeper into it. We have a feasibility. Can the product be developed in the time with the given resources? Economically means, do I have the money for it? Is, again, market size, reimbursement, profitability. That's now in the next step a little deeper. IP, I look closer at the IP. Do I run in trouble there? Or do I have any features that I can patent on my device? Then, very important requirements for sales area, product and development are regulatory things, because again, you have seen US has different regulatory system as Europe, has different regulatory system as Australia. China has a different one with the Chinese FDA. So every country has its own regulatory system, and you may have to go to several approvals. So you even have to think, where do I place my device first? Which is the best strategy? Where do I go? In which country do I go first? It can be very essential in terms of the regulatories. So technical, okay, feasibility, is it producible? Producible, because when you make 100 products, and these are 100 implants, you want to make sure that all 100 patients get a good product. And there's not a faulty or product in there that kills a person, because it can also always be disastrous. And of course, the benefit for the patient and the payer and the fit to workflow. Also in your company, when you're in a company, you have to see, does it fit into my workflow? It doesn't make sense for a company that makes hip prostheses to tomorrow develop a heart valve, for example. It doesn't fit in the workflow. It's similarity, but it doesn't fit in the workflow. So you also have to look, does it fit into there? Because the materials, everything is different. So, project development plan is then the next thing, which is very important. You have the procedures and phases that you define, validation, verification criteria that you set up. You're planning, you have to do a lot of documentation. This starts because documentation you need for your regulatories afterwards. And then there have several procedures that you have to set up. I would recommend to set them up. That means resource plans, who is doing what. You have to look, do I have my resource? Do I have the people for it? Do I have the machines for it? Who is doing what? Roles, resources and responsibilities, that you say you're responsible for the, sewing ring, you're responsible for the package, and that you have people that you have responsible for things. I would always recommend that you have this set up. A thing that's very often forgotten, I always say, even in politics and things, if you look at all the problems of this world, you can make a line under it, and the basic problem that we have then is most of the time communication. It's a simple matter of communication. Even between people, between countries and things. And this is also in the development, and that's why we, for example, in our institution make always a communication plan. We make a plan and say we have in our development, we have these different steps. And there are different people that are important for that and need to be informed. If somebody changed the sewing ring, the one who does the ring, the regular ring, has to know that. So there needs to be a communication. So that you make a clear plan and say who is informed at what point when what happens. This is a communication plan. It's sometimes even more important as the development plan. So that everybody knows exactly what he has to do or what's going on at a certain moment. Because development like that, medical devices are interdisciplinary, you know that, and large groups, you cannot solve that alone. You have a lot of people, and it's important that this is set up. Okay, risk definitions of quality characteristics, specifications, user requirements, requirements for design reviews that you also set up when we review the design. What are the conditions that we set there, and when do we say it's a good or not such a good design. But we'll get to that in a little more detail. Solutions for deviations also, that means what happens if I see that we somehow have to change something. We lost our original target maybe a little bit, we have to readjust our target. So Then the next one is the design development and verification validation phase. This is then the real good stuff. This is where we as engineers come into the play and can do what's needed. So the technical development. For that, usually it's also good to follow some guidelines. There are different models how you do a development. The V model, is that something that you have heard before also? So you're familiar with that. So we can go a little bit through that. Go a little step by step. At the beginning, you have your user requirement specification, where you just say what should the product do and how shall it perform. That means you really write down what is my target. You fix the target. Also a sentence that I have in my head always, and that I tell my students always: never shoot on moving targets. Fix it, shoot, you meet it. So that means you cannot always meet it or fix it, but fix it as good as possible. So that means, and that is the user requirements. Make it very clear what the user wants and then go for it. But if you go through this list, product specification, operating requirement, already at the third one, you get in a little trouble in the medical device. Who is the user? I have a pump, okay? I have a pump. A pump supports the heart, and it has some external controller where I have to set the pump speeds and things and can adjust things and change the battery and do things. That happens when you support the heart. Who is the user? Do you have an idea? Who is the user? The patient? The clinician? When is he the user?
When he's setting it up.
When he's setting it up. The surgeon, when he implants it, is also a user. So that's user number one. Then, as you say, the clinician that sets the speed at the beginning. Next user may be a paramedic that, looks at the patient, maybe still in a hospital environment. And then you send the patient home. Then the patient is the user. So you even go from a user who is very skilled, should be very skilled, hopefully always, the clinician, to the user, to the patient. And the patient is a different story. Even the patient, if he gets in trouble, if the pump, does something wrong and has alarms, he even gets nervous and even is in trouble, and then he may even do things that you don't think about. So that means it's even a user that is under a special stress situation, maybe in that moment. So that even this point, usage and user, is something that is very important and often forgotten. They put displays in there with tiny little numbers on there that every clinician can read. They send a 70-year-old person home, and he cannot read the numbers and pulls the plugs and does whatever. A very, very sad story, as an example, very sad story, to warn you. A pump that supports the heart, and it has a controller, and the pump is life-saving for the patient. And the controller has some error, makes an alarm. So the wife of a patient comes and presses reset because she looks up and says, oh, it's an alarm, and it says reset, so she pushes reset. So the software goes down, not a big deal, goes down and starts new in the controller. What happens is the controller, when he drives up the computer, it tests everything. It tests, among others, the alarm. So alarm goes off again, goes on again. She presses and presses and presses. And Heinz is telling the story all the time. It really happened. It's true. The patient died. So you see what it means, user and usage, how important these things are. Because that's when, at the end, when it really comes to the point. So, but that was a little excursion to other things. But all these things, so you have probably heard about that in former times. It's very important to fix these user requirements. The second one is then the design requirements. That is, how do I achieve that the final product does what the customer required? To make it simple, the customer wants a green car. He says it has to be green. So that the design requirement would finally say, how do we get it green? Do we paint it? Do we take green sheets that we put on it? Or do we, I don't know, put growth factors in and grow grass on it or something like that? So that's the question on how do you achieve what the user wants. That's when we engineers come into play. We have to take this user information and translate it into real things, how we want to do it. It's basically affecting the same things that we have said before. And then component specs, you do that for all the components that are involved. You implement that. Design output means that you design it and you make all your parts, you make some prototypes, and then you do some component testing, that's the verification. Then you do system testing, which is also still verification against the specs. And then you do your product testing against the user requirements. That's the validation. That's when the final product is finished, that's called validation, when you test it under regular conditions. Everything else before is just verification. And it gets more detailed when you go down, and it goes less detailed when you go up again. And the time is, of course, going from left to right. It takes a lot of time. And what's important, how much have you been into risk analysis? Have you done stuff like that? Risk analysis a lot? Yeah, also? It's important to understand that medical devices nowadays, this approval process is more and more for all products linked directly to risk analysis. In former times you said, I have this device, you have to make this and this and this test, and then you get it approved. If it makes sense or not, nobody cares. Nowadays you get told, this is your device, tell me the risk of your device, and tell me how you approached this, how you assessed it, and tell me what you did in order to solve it or to reduce it. And so that is very important, and so I can probably go through that. Also, this is standardized according to 14971. It's a very famous standard from ISO, from the International Standardization Organization. And you always have to know, and that's what some people forget when sometimes press comes and says something happened with a device, there is never 100% safety. We all know that. Even an airplane, as we see, can fall from sky, and so we always should be aware there is never 100% safety on these devices. So what you do is basically you assess your risk. That means you look what kinds of risk do I have, and then you try to implement risk control and mitigation processes. That means to either test it or see how you can improve it. It's important to understand in that regard what is the risk. You have a hazard, and then that can create a hazardous situation, that can create a harm, and then it's the question, how severe is this harm? Yeah? Hazard can be the street is wet. That's just a hazard. The street is wet. Hazardous situation is that you start to slide with your car because the street is wet. And then the harm is you crash into something and you damage something on yourself or the car whatsoever. That's then the harm. And then the question is, how severe is your harm? If you look at that, there is a certain probability that you start to slide when the street is wet, means the probability that the hazard gets to a hazardous situation, and you have a certain probability that you really crash into something. That's then the probability number 2. And so this probability of occurrence of the harm and the severity of the harm gives you risk. It's important to understand because the risk analysis, whenever you make a medical product, you will do it up and down, I can promise you. You will all know what it is when you go into medical device development. So let's take an example. I will show you an example on a medical device, how it could look like, just in general. It's not, don't look too much at the numbers, but just to give you an example. This is a heart valve. Said it before, this is even a heart valve that has, it's not from a pig, but that has even material in there. This material is from bovine material. It's from the sac around the heart of a bovine animal. So that means it has some animal tissue, but as you see, it's in a stent frame. That means it's a medical device, and it's a class 3 device. So, what's that? There's something wrong. The valves, we have 4 valves in our body. We have 2 inlet, 2 outlet, we have 2 chambers. Do you know the heart? Did you have that? Yeah, anatomy. 2 chambers, inlet, outlet. On each chamber there is a valve. Most prominent one in the left part, because the left heart is pumping through the body, and they are mostly affected. That means the inlet and outlet valve of the left heart. These are the ones that are in danger. So there are the valves. This is screwed up. What you can do is you can implant, then you can replace the valve or repair the valve. Let's look at a replacement of the valve. That means there are two basically different types of valves on the market that you can put in via surgery. That means you open the chest, you really cut it, open it, go to the heart, and sew in a new heart valve, means a prosthesis, instead of your failing heart valve. And there are two different ones. There's another way, and that's done nowadays more and more and more, that you do that with a catheter. That means we have, the vessels are all interconnected, of course, because they carry the blood, and they somehow go to the heart back. You can go in a vessel in the leg, you can shift in a catheter up to the heart, shift it in, and you have a valve in this catheter, and then you bring this in place. You see that here, that you shift it, basically this is called the femoral artery, that is an artery here in the leg. You can go with the catheter up to this position where your failing valve is. And what you do then is that you have a stent frame, you have your tissue in there, and that makes this valve. You put it in your catheter, and then you shift your catheter up, and then you shift the valve out of the catheter, and it opens and goes into the position, like a stent. Did you ever hear that, see that, or yeah? That's done more and more. We call it a transcatheter valve implantation, because you do it with the catheter. In former times, patient got big surgery, and so the chest was opened, and then it took, a week that he had to be first on intensive care, then he gets on a regular section, etc. Nowadays he goes in the evening, he can go home if everything works fine. He gets it in there, goes home. But there are some risks associated with it. So it sounds good, so everybody would say, why should I do this? But there are some risks, because it's a blind flight, right? They have to shift it in, know where it is, and there's a lot that can go wrong. The first thing that can go wrong, this material is very sensitive. This is originally animal tissue. If you touch it, it may have some defects on the surface. And after time, these defects may cause a rupture of the valve or something. In former times, the surgeons, when they put it in with surgical means, they were always told never touch the leaflet because it can be bad afterwards in the outcome. Now you put it suddenly in such a catheter. You crimp it into such a catheter and then release it afterward. You can imagine this is all metal. You can imagine that you may touch this tissue and that you may damage it, and that the durability of that valve is affected by that. So basically, what you do now, you do your risk analysis. This is just one part. There are many other risks associated, but just as an example, we have a degraded valve durability maybe as a hazard. The event that has caused that was because it was damaged in the crimping process. It may have been damaged. So what happens, the hazardous situation, is that the leaflets tear, that they rupture a little bit, and they don't really close anymore because the valve doesn't close anymore, or that they calcify. These valves anyway tend after time in the body to calcify, that calcium is deposited and they calcify. And that may even go quicker if they have a damage, that they very quickly calcify, and that's then an indication for reoperation. That means this patient has to come back, then gets the next valve. And you don't want to do that too often. So the harm is that if the leaflet is not really closing anymore, that there is blood going through the valve when it opens, and when the valve, it's a check valve, when it closes, there's a leakage going back to the heart. I'll give you an example. The heart goes 40 million times a year, when you only take, and as you might know, we have each time that we have each stroke, we have about 70 ml that the heart throws out, and it does that 40 million times. If we have a leakage in this valve, that's only 10%. We would say it's only 7 milliliters that are lost because the heart has to pump then 77 milliliters out, because 7 go back and the 70 come to the body. The body needs the 70. Doesn't sound very much. 7 milliliters, so what? 40 million times, you can calculate it, 280,000 liters. The heart has to pump 280,000 liters more in a year, in 1 year. And you can imagine if you do that for a long time, then you get the next trouble and can put a pump on it because the heart is also broken. So that means it's something that is a harm. You can say the severeness, it's just a number. Let's take the numbers on the scale to 1 to 5 is 4. The probability is rather low, it's 2. And the risk class is then, as a factor from that, 3, just as a number. We don't want to go in detail. So what you do then is, as next, you say, let's look at it. What can I do about it? I can improve my crimpability. I can make this somehow do some technical improvement so that it's not crimped so much. And I can do, of course, testing, a lot of testing, and see, is it really that bad? And does it really happen that often? So for that, you can do some testing, and I show you just as an example, durability testing or calcification testing. You take the valve, that's what we do in a lab then. You take a valve, you put it in a test chamber, and then you put it it's in that chamber, and then you can see there you work on the valve, and then you have some fluid in there, and then you have either a leaflet rupture or you may have a stent fracture whatsoever that you see. And you have seen that it worked pretty fast. If you say a manufacturer has to prove, as an example, that a valve at least lasts 5 years. I said before, 40 million cycles a year is regularly our heart in rest, 40 million cycles roughly, times 5, 200 million cycles. That means you have to prove that your valve works for 200 million cycles. And you cannot sit there and wait 5 years until you have done that. So what we do, of course, we try to make accelerated testing. That means you accelerate the cycle rate and try to get it not in 5 years, but in 0.5 years, because you do it times 10, for example. You go with, as I say, there 800 to 1,000 per minute instead of 70 per minute, what we have. So that is a test that you can do, and then you can crimp them, uncrimp them, and do all this, and test again, and see how much does it affect the valve, as an example. You could also, the next thing, if you take not water into that, or saline solution, if you take some solution that has a lot of calcium phosphate in there. Calcium phosphate is, if we have a lot of calcium phosphate, that's what causes the calcification. Particularly in young children, when they grow up, they have to grow bones, and that means they have a lot of calcium phosphate in their body, so you may never put a biological valve into them because they calcify immediately because there's so much calcium phosphate in there, also as a little comment. So, but then you can see, do we have calcification of that valve after a time? And this is then in micro-CT. That means we can see everything that's white is calcium in there, and we can measure, there is a lot of calcium or not so much, and they calcify quicker or less quicker depending on how much I crimp them. And when you have done all that, there's a picture missing. Oh, no, this is basically, this should come again. If you have done all that, then you can say, okay, I have tested it, I have did my measures, I have improved my crimping, I have done all kinds of things, and now I'm in a refined rank of 1 and a residual probability rank. That means my probability is lower than I thought, and I get it into a lower risk class. With testing, with improving, and that's what you do when you say iterative development. You said that you want to make a break, or?
Maybe have them come back at 3:05.
It's what?
Maybe just a 5 to 10 minute break.
Should we make a 5-minute break?
Yeah.
Yeah. We have some water here. We have some water here.
Yeah.
Huh? Is that yours, or?
Yeah. It's good if you have many more to get through. Do you know how many slides you have?
No. I think 10, 15.
Oh, so not many at all.
No, I have some extra slides, but I won't use them because
Well, you can. You have plenty. I mean, you'll be back by 3:05, and then you have 45 minutes. So, it's going to be fun.
Depends what you want.
No, it's up to you. I mean, I don't have anything else to talk to them about today. So you can, if you want to finish early, you can also. You can let them go early. It's completely up to you.
It depends because it looks like that I'm.
Oh, actually, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
Thanks everyone. We'll get started again on the second half of the
So, sorry. Sean just made a little comment. I see that you're all making notes. You can have the slides afterwards, so don't worry about that. You get the slides, so that means if you want to make other comments, it's fine, but you will have them. Okay, this is where we were at the end. That means it was just an example how we tried do verification, validation testing, and also risk mitigation in order to reduce the risk on or assess the risk on a medical device. So let's go to the next step. The next step is then the final validation and the product launch phase. This is always the big thing. For an implant, it's always when you call it FIM, first in man, and in the meantime you say FIP, first in person, to be gender neutral. But you see this something FIP, FIM when you see that. That's always a big thing for every company. When you have your product, you develop for 5, 6, 7 years and put in 50 million and all kinds of things, and then you put it first time, particularly if it's an implant, put it first time in the patient. And then because you can test whatever you want and you can do whatever you want. There is always the human body. It's where you test blood, your device in blood, you test it in, do flow studies, do material studies, all kinds of things, but in the human body it all comes together. And so very often it may happen, unfortunately, that you still have a surprise. Hopefully not a bad one. So that means that is your phase when you go into the final validation and the product launch. And then that is basically your approval phase. Then you have different processes. I said that before. It's a little different in the US than it is in Europe or in Australia or in China or other places. I've chosen here US and Europe to show the differences, whereas I would say most of the countries follow the so-called ISO standards, which means that it's quite similar in Europe, Australia, and other places. China is a little bit more FDA, that they have their Chinese FDA, so it's a little bit more that way. So, but it's these models. So first thing is that you classify your device. As we said, you have to know that before when you go to the FDA, well, you have to know clearly what is my device, is it class 1, 2, 3. You classify it yourself, and then you go to them, because when you classify it, you see here, if you have a class 3, you have do a pre-market approval, which is then an approval studies. We get to that in the next one. That means you choose your pre-market submission. And what you can do is you can think about, and there's different, FDA, for example, you see this 510K, PMA, De Novo, HDE. They offer 4 different ways that you get your approval for your device. And you have to look at that very closely and think about it. What is the best way for you? Because I can tell you this is what costs money. This approval phase, as I said before, you have everything lined up. Your production is going, everything. Because the devices that you put in a person, even if it's the first one, has to be produced under regular conditions. The ones that you use afterwards. That means your production, everything is set up. You bought machines, you have your clean rooms and all these things, and then you start that. And then, if you then go a wrong way and it takes you 3 or 4 years instead of 1 year, you can imagine what it costs. This is what I meant before when you really should think about it. This is something that you should really think about. Which way do I go? You see, 510K is one thing that many people like to do. You say, there is a heart valve on the market that is exactly like my heart valve. Actually, I admit I did a Me Too product, but mine has just a little advantage, but other than that, it performs like that one. So I don't have to make a big deal. I can just put it in, and because it's all like that. So that is 510K. Sounds easy, it's not so easy. Because how do you prove that you did everything like the other valve? You take the material. How do you know that this manufacturer, the other manufacturer, which you copied, had the same material and processed it the same way? For that, you would have to have the detailed knowledge at what it's doing, and nobody knows that except that manufacturer and the FDA, but they don't give it. That means it's very difficult. It sounds easy, but it's not so easy to go that path. Many companies think that's the easy way. They try to go it, and then they find out it's not so easy, because they have to prove, is it really everything the same than the other one? The other thing is, the next is a PMA, pre-market approval. That is a full approval. That's what you need for a class 3 device, particularly valve, pump, something, these high-risk devices. That means you go and do a full scientific evidence, assurance, safety, and effectiveness. That means you do full preclinical trials. Preclinical trials are very often mainly animal trials. They are named preclinical trials, but you have to do them. And then you go into your clinical trials. Clinical trials means you may not implant it because it's not yet a device that's safe. On the other hand, you have to implant it in order to find out whether it's safe. So it's a catch-22. And that's why you do a clinical trial. That means it's basically, you can also say to some degree, an investigational device exemption. That means you get an exemption that you may put it, you have done all your testing and the FDA says you can put in, let's say, 150 of your valve in patients and control them very, very closely. Look at them every day, look if something happens, report everything, and monitor them very closely, and that for, let's say, 1 year. And if after 1 year, nothing happened, everything's fine, then you get your approval. And then you can sell it. Before, you may not sell it. Before, it's just not a product, it's just in your exemption phase. That's a pre-market approval, takes a long time. Sounds easy if you say, for example, we heart valve, I have a lot to do with heart valves, they say, in Europe, for example, you have to do 150 valves in patients in at least 5 centers, in different centers, to make sure that you don't have them only in one center who knows how it works, but the other ones afterwards screw up. So that means you have to go in 5 centers and do, in average, 25 per center. And you have to do a so-called randomized study. Randomized means you cannot put them in every patient that comes in. You have to randomize, select, and say this patient gets the original one, the regular one, and then you have a patient, every 5th patient or something you take and say, I put it in there, and then he has to, of course, agree, he or she, the patient. You cannot just put it in. You tell him, it's a new valve, we don't know, but it should be better, but then he has to agree. Huh? And that takes then a long time to even get your 150 valves in. Sometimes it takes 1.5, 2 years to have all these 150 patients because you randomize in the clinics and you cannot take everyone. And then you have to wait another year until the last one was monitored. So it can take easily 3 years, something like that. And imagine you have burn rates and your money is going down the drain and you're sitting there and hoping that it works out. So that is PMA. De novo is you have something totally new, wasn't there before, and you say, there is no comparison, and I don't know what to do with it. It's de novo. We have a very interesting de novo exemption at the moment ongoing. Do people have Apple Watch? Who has an Apple Watch? Apple Watch? Nobody? No Apple Watch? Yeah. Apple Watch 4? 4? It can do ECG, right? Can yours do it? The point is, it could do it. It could. Where did you buy it? Where? Here? Yeah. It can't. It cannot do ECG. If you went to the US and buy it in the US, it would do ECG. Interesting. It can do an ECG. It can also look at your pulse and look whether you have an irregular pulse. For example, atrial fibrillation, which can be a dangerous situation. It can check all that. But in that moment that you do that, it's a medical device. It's not a watch anymore. It's a medical device. So the Apple had to go to the FDA and say, I have a medical device. I measure ECG and everything, and now you can say, wow, there is so much ECG devices on the market, how can they do de novo? Because it's not new to measure an ECG or to measure the pulse. They say it's the first time ever that a consumer product goes directly from the store to the consumer and is used by the consumer for ECG measurement. Not by a clinician or something where you do your ECG, it's done by the consumer, and that's new. And so they have, indeed, they got a de novo exemption. They are cleared through the FDA for de novo. But in the US and in other countries, Australia and other countries, they are negotiating at the moment, but no other countries has approved them yet. So it's an interesting thing. So you learn how this works. That means in other countries, you may never know if it comes out at all in some countries. Maybe they don't accept it. Remember when I said at the beginning, look at your regulatory pathways, look at all this. It may be that you run in trouble that you haven't seen before because of regulatory issues. You have to know that it's a medical device when you start developing that. They probably knew it. But so it's just an interesting thing. So, and by the way, you have to buy it in the US. They register the number and you have to buy it in the US. If you buy it here and then go in the US or something, it doesn't work. It has to be bought in the US. That's also an interesting thing.
Can you bring it here and will it still work?
Yes, it will work. You can go in another country, it will work, but since the US has some different frequencies in there, if you have one for LTE, they have different frequencies, that means it may not work fully here. But the ECG will work here, yes. That will work. So once you have, but you have to install it also at the beginning, the first installation in the US. If you buy it there, go here and install it, done. So just as I don't know whether I thought it was an interesting story because I just read that a few days ago. I read that and I thought it's a typical example for these regulatory things. So you know how it works. Watch out if you make a device like that. Okay, so then we have step 3, prepare appropriate information. That means you have your design controls, your quality, but you have to have, of course, a quality management and have to prepare everything about the non-clinical testing, that you have to show that all the tests that you did are according to certain standards. That's called GLP, Good Laboratory Practice. That tells you how you have to document all the tests you have to. When you are engineers in companies and you do testing and all this, or development in general, you will do 50% and more of your time you will be writing. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that, but it's because today is documentation, documentation, documentation. So everything has to be pinned down. So, and that is that you have to prepare all this data, even up to labeling. That means you have to also look, what do I have to put on the label? You cannot just write, this is the best watch on earth or something. You have to put specification on the labeling. And if you put them on there, watch out what you put on there. They will make you responsible against that if you put something else on there. So you can get in deep trouble if you put something wrong on there. Send pre-market submission, and then you go to the FDA, you hope everything's fine, and then you get it cleared, and then you get your device approved. That means in that moment you may start to sell it, at least in the US. FDA is then for the US. So then you may sell it. Then you may really take money for it. Before, it's all in this testing stage.
What if the FDA did not approve it, right? But the consumer themselves have liked to use it and buy it as well. Would that still be?
Usually the manufacturer will get trouble. The manufacturer, because it's not approved. If the manufacturer gives the consumer, there is a little difference. There is one point. It's a very interesting point. The manufacturer, if he willingly or knowingly does something like that and gives it to somebody and says, you can put it in, and somebody puts it in, then the manufacturer is in fault. That happens more often. If the manufacturer gives somebody a sample or whatsoever, and somebody goes into a hospital and puts it in, and the manufacturer has told him, don't put that in, or it's on the box, not for human use, and somebody puts it in, then the manufacturer said, come on, it's not my fault. So then the next thing is, and that's the freedom of therapy of the physician. That's a totally new story. The physician may take things and just put them in and say, it's my responsibility. I'll tell you an interesting story. Drug-eluting stents. These are, do you know drug-eluting stents? Does it tell something? These are stents, little wire frames, that you can put in a vessel, and you open them up, and then you can, if you have a clotted vessel, you can open it up again. Particularly in the coronaries, when you have a heart attack, you know they are clotted, and then you put in the stent, and you open it up, and then the blood can go through again. And they are so-called drug-eluted stents. That means after a while, what happened that if the vessel is injured by this procedure, it may happen that the cells think, oh, there is something broken, and they grow in there and they close it again, because they grow in there and try to fix something which shouldn't be fixed. Can you follow? So that's why then people said, oh, we put drugs in there that prevent these cells to grow in there, but help the good cells, the endothelial cells they are called, help the good cells to make a nice layer in there. Yeah, so they put drugs on there. But then suddenly you have a combination device. You have a device that's a stent. It's okay, class 3. And you all probably have heard drugs takes easily 10 years to get them approved. So the thing is that you would use a drug that is established for that. But even then you have to approve that you don't change anything on the drug while you manufacture that stent. And you cannot just put it on the device. You usually have a little polymer coating on the stent, and you implement it in the polymer so that it can go out after for weeks and months. Because you don't want to have, if otherwise you put it in, it would be all gone. That is a long process to develop that. We did that in Munich. When I was in Munich at the university, we had an idea and it worked. We said we take a stent and we have structured the stent on the surface with acid. We structured it very roughly so that it can take some fluid on the surface and is not polished so that the fluid will go away right away. And then we built a so-called magic box. We called it the magic box. And we took the magic box, was just a box where you can put in the stent, press a button, and then it sprays the drug on the surface. And then you have the drug on the surface, and because it was structured on the surface, the drug doesn't go out immediately. It takes it stays in there for a while. And then we could go to the German regulatory authorities and say, look, magic box, it's just a spraying machine. Nothing, class 1, no problem. Because we don't do anything to the patient or whatsoever. And then we go to the hospital, go to the cardiologist, say, here's your magic box, here's the stent, and there's the patient. And then he takes his stent, puts it in the magic box, sprays it, puts it in the patient. He may do that. Freedom of the physician, freedom of therapy. So we had no approval, nothing, just this magic box. It's a box like anything else, and it was in the clinic with an existing stent that was just a little roughened on the surface. It didn't work out too good. In the meantime, it's still in the clinic, but not used very often because it comes out too quickly. But it's just to give you an idea, because in that regard, the question is very good. It's something that you can always think about. If you have a chance to get the clinician more involved, you have to be careful with that, because you don't want to bring him in trouble. But if you have that chance, you can make a trick there and try to get around things. Because if he does that, if he puts the drug on it, it's his decision. It's his decision. Huh? So that is also, a little story to understand a little bit more how this all works. There are many tricks out there. Sometimes they are not good also. Sometimes, I think we are okay. So we were here, we were with the FDA, and let's look at the EU. It's a little similar. It's not so much different. In the EU, that we have also that we classify our medical device, that we introduce a quality management. You have to have a quality. We probably all heard about ISO 9001. There is also 13485, which is then for medical products. That means a quality system in a company that makes medical products is more strict than a regular one. And that's why they have what we call the 13485. This is the ISO standard for medical device manufacturers, which is a little more strict. So you have, it says EG, you can use another quality management. You can even say, I don't take 13485, I make my own one. I just prove that I do everything's quality controlled, and etc. You can do that if you want, but I don't recommend that, because then you will have to answer a lot of questions. And a lot of questions mean a lot of time. A lot of time means a lot of money. So you better take 13485, like it is there, put your certificate on the wall and say, there it is, and then nobody asks a question. You're through. Huh? So always watch out with that. So then you have your design dossier. Depending on when you have a class 3 device, it's called a design dossier, or other than that, it's a technical file that you have to prepare and that you have to give the notified body. If you're not here, if you're, for example, if you're not in Europe, as an example, you're an Australian manufacturer and you want to get an EC mark in Europe, you have to appoint also a representative in Europe. Or vice versa also, that because if something goes wrong, they want to know in Europe that they have somebody that they can take and say, listen, this doesn't work, or the other way around. So you have to, that's why this is in gray, this is depending where you are. And then you have to, you get this controlled by a notified body, and that's a difference in Europe. For example, and I'm saying that because in Australia they're also going in that direction. In Europe they have so-called notified bodies. Not like the US has one FDA taking care of everything, one authority. In Europe we have so-called notified bodies. These are companies, basically. And these companies have to be specially certified that they may approve products. We have scandals. Did somebody hear about these implant files that was coming up last year in December or something? It was December sometime. Big scandal. Everybody was saying, oh, it cannot work, that companies certify company products, get money for that. That means it's a conflict of interest. They put from one pocket to the other, and they put devices out on the market which are crap. Of course, that doesn't work. If a notified body does something wrong, the so-called competent authority in the respective area will take him and he will get his license withdrawn. And that will be it for him, means for the company. For this notified body. So you have to be very careful with that. They are really very strictly controlled. But that's a difference, and in Australia it's also that we have here the TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration. TGA, they do that like the FDA a little bit, but they have too much work and they can't compete, don't have the resources, and they are also thinking of appointing notified bodies to do a similar system like in Europe, here in Australia. That's what they are working on. So that means that you can then, in Europe it's about 60 different notified body. That means as a company, as a manufacturer, you can select. You can say, I take the one from, I don't know, BSI or the TÜV Product Service or this and that. There are 60 companies and you can choose your notified body. And not every notified body is allowed to approve, for example, class 3 devices. The ones that do class 3 devices have a special certificate. So there are only a few. And that means, but it's basically you can choose them. So that's the approval process in the EU, and I said similar to Australia. It's quite similar. And Australia is clearly trying to harmonize. Australia is even looking at harmonizing it so much that an approval in Australia would be valid and you would get a CE mark for Europe and vice versa. That means if you have a CE mark, you could even go into Australia. That would link it pretty much, and that would be also a good chance, I say that in general, for Australia to do even more studies here, because if you can approve here and you get the entire CE mark, that would open the market also a little bit more. So I think it's a good move. Standardization organizations, just, what was it, 50? Yeah, okay. I'm just looking at the time. Just from the product side, to just give you a little idea also from that side, we always talked about ISO so far. That means when you want to approve your product, most of the time you have certain standards that you have to look at. And there are always national standardization organizations. You see here in Australia, it's, for example, Standards Australia. You have Russians, Chinese. No, this is Chinese, and this is Japanese. You have ANSI, the American ones. I'm not so good in reading Chinese, but but I could read that. So I'm sorry for that. And we have the German DIN. So in every country you have to look whether you have special national ones that you have to look at, whether they put something on top of the international standards, that they have special requirements. We like to do that in Germany. We like to make things more complicated than they were already. And probably in other countries that's also sometimes the case. So, and you have, of course, the International Standardization Organization is probably the one that you all know. It's ISO. ISO is always, we said it before, ISO 9001, ISO 13485. It's an international standardization organization with a seat in Switzerland, and I think 160 countries are member of ISO. That means they basically help to set up the standards. And there are a lot of committees for all the products or for all the processes that come together once a year or twice a year to write these standards. For example, I'm also heading one of these committees, in my case for heart valve. There is a standard for heart valve approval, and there are people from all over the world coming every September. We have a meeting and in between meetings, and we write these standards then. And once they're finished, they go out, and then they are mandatory to follow them from the countries that accept them. There may be that a country says, I don't like that standard, I make my own thing, and I don't accept it. So that may happen. But other than that, usually ISO is the one that is more important. And it's also, when you do that and when you look at that, very important to understand that there are normative standards. That means the word is must. You must do that. You must do this and this test. No exemption. And they are informative, descriptive standards. They help you they say, well, you should look at that and that, and if you do that, we would recommend that you do it this and this way. You don't have to do it that way, but we recommend it. This is informative. And most of the time you would say, you'd be better off to do it that way. Because otherwise you argue, and again, always think about that, getting questions and having to argue means time, and time means money, and money, don't do that. And there are guidances, and that's what the FDA has or others. They say, if you do a device like that, we expect that you would deliver these and these data. They give you a guidance. And you also basically look at that, and you would basically then, if they say that, you would basically do it that way. And what we have nowadays, and that's why I'm pointing that out again, risk management, I mentioned that before. Nowadays, when you do your medical device, when you develop that, finally, the product approval is in most of the standards nowadays. All these standards are moving towards risk management. That means they all tell you finally, do your risk analysis, your risk assessment, and show me which residual risk is there. So that means this is something that is nowadays the absolute, you can say, A and O of any development, that you know about your risk analysis. That's why I'm pointing that out. And if you are good in that, and if you can get that straight, that's very good. Now, and we come to the risk analysis, and that is more or less, I think that's done. Because when we then go to the product launch and the post-launch assessment, that means you have now gone through the FDA and you say, yes, we made it. You went to Europe, yes, we made it to Australia, and you can sell your product. It's not over. For a medical product, it's not over. Because once it's out and you may sell it, it was, for example, also in Europe, and it will be also in Australia, that before you were approved and you could sell it forever, except something really bad happens. Nowadays, the regulations change everywhere, because you see that when you do your risk analysis, and you can imagine you make something totally new, and you don't know all the risks, you will find out about the risks when you have the product on the market. You will see how it performs on the market, and suddenly you may have situations where, hopefully never, but patients die or do whatever. Because something happened that whatever you've done, you could never have predicted that. So we had that also with heart valves about 20 years ago. Do you know what cavitation is? Cavitation in pumps? When you have very low pressure at a vein from a pump, you have a suction pressure, then you get little bubbles create, because you get under the vapor pressure. So little bubbles create, and they implode again, and they have so much energy when they implode that they even destroy. It's like you see a vein, and it looks like somebody like a mouse had been eating on the vein. You see pitting, we call pitting traces. Because it's so much energy that even parts are really cut out of the surface. That's cavitation. And we had so-called mechanical heart valves that have mechanical, you have seen one on a picture before, that have mechanical leaflets, and they open and close, and they're just rigid materials. And they can close pretty fast, and then underneath, when they close, you get a suction pressure. You can imagine the flow comes back, and they close, and then you get a suction pressure. You hear that sometimes if you have a water hose, very old in earlier times. You're too young, you don't know that. But in earlier times, the water hoses at home, when you closed them, very suddenly they made a real noise. That's because because suddenly you cut the flow and you get this cavitation. And this happened, nobody thought about that. That happened in heart valves in late 80s, beginning of the 90s. I was involved in that, in testing them afterwards, because we were all saying that people died. The valves broke, and if a heart valve broke, dead. And you can imagine if these leaflets, even they break and they even travel, they go immediately. It's not that you don't have a valve anymore, they also go someplace and they create, I don't know, strokes and all kinds of, because there are pieces in your body. Terrible. But nobody knew what happened. And then they had some patients where they found the leaflets afterwards. Sounds very, strange, I know. And then suddenly we saw these pitting traces where we said, this is cavitation. And then we thought, of course, if they close too fast, there may be cavitation, because there may be a gas bubble underneath, and the gas bubble implodes, and then suddenly you have these were ceramic leaflets, and ceramic is prone to sudden rupture. That means they get micro cracks from these gas bubbles, and then patch, from one moment to the other, they are gone, and the patients die. Coming back to that, that's something that you don't know before. I mean, you never think about something like that, no? When you do the risk analysis. But this is why nowadays we say, okay, the device goes out, everybody has done his risk analysis, has done everything, and it goes out, and suddenly in the field, in the patient, even after approving the first 100 patients or something, things happen regularly. If you have the first one that happens, you would say, the second one. Again, bad example, the MAX 8 came from when it crashed in Indonesia. People say, Now, the second time it crashes, everybody, with the airplane, everybody says, wait a second, this is not normal. We have to stop that. And then they keep them on the ground. It's basically the same what happens with medical devices. If you see that something happens, you try to analyze it, and if it 2-3 times happens and there is a similarity, you would immediately say stop. And this is what also is the case nowadays, that you have what you call a post-market surveillance. That means once you have your product on the market, it's not done. You have to re-qualify your product every 5 years. You have to bring in documents and say, this is what happened in the last 5 years. You have to anyway report any adverse event, if it's a major event. But even the data, regular data that on a day-to-day basis, because some patients doing better, some doing worse, but it's not a real adverse event. But the data suddenly show after 5 years, your valve is much worse than all the other ones on the market. It doesn't perform as good. The patients are not doing as good and everything. Then you will get trouble. You have to reevaluate it, and then they may even say, we stop it. This is more and more shifting that it's going towards the post-market surveillance. That means that you have to really always follow up what happens in the field with your medical device. And that will also be very resource intensive. That means companies have to have all these people that follow that up and all kinds of things, so there will be also a lot of things. So that's why I put that in here, post-market surveillance. And basically what you do is that you look at adverse events. That's what I said. Adverse events is really if something bad happens. But you also look at, you make audits all the time. That means nowadays these notified bodies or the FDA then goes to the manufacturer, like they even have what they call unannounced audits. That means the manufacturer can have shown he has a quality management, everything's fine and everything's wonderful. Then the auditor goes home and then they do everything different. Because once he's gone, so now they say, and before it was that the auditors, the notified bodies or whoever, FDA, had to announce that they are coming. It's like you clean your house, you get it announced, you clean your house, make everything nice, so it's always like that. So that is not the case anymore. They may do unannounced audits, they may come and stand in front of the door from one moment to the other and say, I want to inspect everything. So these audits have changed. You have to trace more, you have to do more sampling and testing. That means even in your regular production, when you say I have even a special control or some things are only random control, you have to take more samples and find out that every device that you have is like the other one. Safety alerts, recalls, even also what we have, a recall. So that is basically all the activities that you have to do. And that then, and now we come back to the risk analysis, what I said before. Basically, you have your risk analysis, you make your post-market surveillance, you get your clinical evaluation, and you feed this data back in the risk analysis. And that's why we are, for example, sitting there when we write up these ISOs in this committee, the new standards, that they are revised every 5 years. That means you make a new standard, and then it goes out, and then you watch what happens, and then in the meantime, you take new events that happened and write that in the next one that you say, oh, you have to also take this and this and this in account. So that means you try to update the standards so that always all these things are in there. So this is then the medical device. Basically, I think it's, yeah. We have now talked about this development process in a little bit more, at some areas broad, some details, but that you have to look at marketing, user requirement specification, and. Now, that is when you develop technically, and we also talked about that you need money for it, and it may also be that you have a great idea, and that you say, I make a company, and I make a medical device, and I want to be entrepreneur, and I go out there. I can tell you medical device is not easy, as you can see, particularly class 3, you need millions and millions. The most time in your life you will spend with investors and fighting with them and things, so I can, it's fun. It's very challenging, but it's really a lot of fun. And for that you need, first thing, what you have learned now is you need to make a business plan, and basically you have now seen many elements that finally are asked in the business plan also. We talk about development plan, we talk about marketing, we talk about reimbursement. Is it paid somewhere? So you have to make, now from that, you have to make your plan. If you want to do your own company, you say, I have my idea. Maybe you already made a little prototype, say, oh, it looks good and everything. And then you want to go out and want to go to investors and say, I need the money for that. And then you make your business plan with the different chapters. You make an executive summary. Executive summary, most important part in the business plan. When you write it, that's the document. Because an investor sits in his office and he has 200 on his desk for just the morning, so to read. And so what he will do is open, read executive summary, and if it's not exciting or whatsoever, you're on the wrong heap. You're out. So that means I always say, watch out, because many people do that, and you may do that also sometimes. Nowadays, more and more, you have less time to read things. You just read the summaries and say, oh, sounds interesting. Then you go into it. Then you say, oh, I want to read that. Whereas if you read the abstract in a publication or something, and you say, oh, boring stuff, did that before, you will never read the whole thing. You put it away. So that means that is an important part. So that's where you have the chance to create some excitement on the investor side. Then you have the background. For example, in this case, it would be for, I think it was for a stand or something. I took it from the internet, so you can find those tons in the internet. But then you write a background. What is the problem? You know, heart disease or this and that, and I want to make a new stent, and this is what is on the market. There are other products on the market and competitors, but they have goods and bads, and you talk about the market itself, how many people would need it, and how do I have my strategy in order to bring it in there. And also operating strategy, the milestones, commercialization risks, and then company and management and financial information. This is a typical contents of a business plan. And as far as I understand, you have to make a business plan, right? That's why I'm showing that. So that means basically these things that we have talked about, the more you have them really taken care of and making it in a exciting way, the more you will attract investors, the more you can prove I have looked at everything and it's all fine, the more they will say, oh, sounds safe, because it's called risk capital, but they don't want to go risk. So that means the more safe it is, the more chances you have. So that means this is basically, with all the knowledge that you have seen before, is important. And I tell you also one thing which is very important, and when you write, do they do that everybody alone or in teams? What is most of the time, I call it like in former times, it's, do you say head money? How do you say that in English? Head money? You know, in former, when the Wild West, when you shoot a person that is, did something wrong and you bring him dead and you get money, get an award, how do you call that? Huh? Down? Bounty? Yeah? Bounty. Okay, so I would call, for fun, I call that also bounty, what you get from the investors, because an investor will look, first of all, very closely at you. Because it's this, whatever we talk here about, and development and technology is only what the people, and that's you, make out of it. So it's always a human issue. And investors would then always, I would always say, 80% is bounty of the money that they give you. The technology should be given. That means you should have a market, you should have technology. It's important. I mean, without a market, they will immediately see that and say, well, that's crap. We don't do that. There's no market, no way. But let's take, this is all given. Then the difference is basically you. It's basically that they see this person will do it. This person will go through all the way, go through all the ups and downs and will do it. Has the passion for it. This is very important. This is what I call the entrepreneur's gene that you would have to have. So just as it's not written down somewhere or something. Maybe you can read it in the internet, but this is my personal experience. And sometimes we also do the other way around. We invest a little bit in some, not all the companies I created my own. Some of them I'm just a shareholder. So that means you look at the team and say, I put my money on his or her head. That's basically what they do to 80%. Maybe not, maybe some 60, whatsoever. Just to give you an idea. So it's very important that also company management, you say, we can do. That's very important. So, and then if you're lucky, or maybe sometimes there are events, and then they choose you and say, you're great, we want to learn more, and then you do your pitch. And that's, you heard that word, and you probably know that also. That means then you get the chance to go someplace and say, I will present what are my idea and everything. And this pitch, sometimes it's also referred to as elevator pitch. Do you know, I don't know, do you know where it comes from, this word, that you only have 3 minutes while the elevator is going up with an investor, and you have to get him there. Just imagine that. That means you have to be very convincing with these pitches, and there you have the generator here and other places where these things are trained and where you learn something about. So for those people who have a desire or want to do something like that, there are very good chances to learn how this works. And so that is then when you do your pitch, and then hopefully they give you a lot of money, and hopefully they give you a lot of money without taking everything away from you, but leave you a little bit a little rest of your company, because they of course want shares from that, and so you want to keep some parts. But this is something, as I understand, that you have to do, this business plan. That means that you have to have your idea, and you can now think about all the things that are involved and try to get that together to a nice business plan at the end, and hopefully convince some investors. Maybe, are you the investor or who is the investor? Huh? Yeah. Convince Sean that you did the right thing. So with that, I think it's enough for today. You probably had to listen long enough. And I thank you very much. It was a lot of fun, and I hope that you can take a little bit with you. And yeah, good luck with your business plan. Thank you.
And just keep in mind, workshops this week is still focusing on your individual project elements. Same as last week. Thanks. Nice one. That's great.
One step. Get the slides before the lecture.
Yeah, I can send them tonight. Which way? Is it PDF or regular? Or?
Send me the PowerPoint and then
Yeah. Well, I can more easily convert it.
Well, I would
because it's too big. There is videos in there. It's about, I don't know, probably 100K or something like that.
If you don't mind sending the PowerPoint, because that would be...
Yeah. No.
K.O., ja, aber nicht bei dir. Bei Jutta. Gut, ja.